over documentation.
Right. And that, so what you're talking about is, I mean, somebody's got to be a bit tenacious, at least in certain organizations, to make that a thing the way you're describing it.
Yeah.
What about, let me flip that on its head you've got a designer that's saying, well, you know, why don't they come to me? It's not my job to figure this out for them. How would you coach that designer to saying, you know, but if you're more part of the team and you're not just punching a clock, you're going to do better work, right? I mean, but how do you have that conversation?
I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at.
So you, like you were saying, go after it.
Yeah.
But I talk to a lot of user experience designers that are like, it should come to me. That's not my job.
Okay. So you are saying what I'm thinking you're saying. I'm going to be a jerk for a second and say it's really difficult for me to get in the mind of that person.
Okay.
I would not hire that person.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because, you know, I'm not interested in people who are interested mainly in punching a clock.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like design, especially user experience design, or even any sort of human-centered design, there has to be some sort of fire behind that, some sort of intrinsic motivation to do things for people. Because, you know, the designer who doesn't care if it's their job, you know, they want to make the best thing, you know, and they feel like doing this thing, whether it's their job or not, is part of what needs to happen in order to make things better for people.
Sure, I understand that. And my point being is that some organizations, or I should say some people, allow themselves to be changed into those people, right? Because I got my hand slapped for doing this before, so I'm not going to do that again. Or somebody gave me rough feedback because I was sitting in a meeting that I shouldn't have been sitting in, that I didn't know. And then over time, I can become jaded and I can become kind of bitter at this, and I can say, you know, well, you know, that's not my job, you know, because I've been told before that that's not my job. And so for me, I totally understand what you're saying. Like if somebody just out of the blue that I just met said that's not my job, of course I would be like, why are you even here then? You know. But I feel that, like, because of the changes that have happened, especially in user experience design over the years, and one of the things, and this is another thing I talked about too, is that if you go back to the year 2000, the first book I read on user experience design was just like these 4 stages. You know, you do discovery, you do wires, you do visual, and then you do research, and you kind of just keep doing that over and over again. And then the next thing, you know, years later, because I put that up from that original book, which I don't remember the name of it now, but it might have been called user experience design or something. Then next to that, I put up Cori Stearns' model on what user experience is, which is like a galaxy of
super
services.
comprehensive.
Yes, a galaxy of services, right? One of the things that I coach people on is that, you know, you can make user experience a lot more complex to the layman than you need to. I think while Cori's model definitely has a place in what we're doing, it doesn't mean that that's the first thing you show a potential CTO or new client, because I think it frightens them because it's like, wow, that's a lot, right? I get, you know, it's the same thing as when somebody shows up and says they need to be ISO certified and things. It's what I feel like my worry is that some people are moving to an ISO standard with user experience design in some ways, where it has to go through these gates and it has to do these things, right? And I know that you said at the beginning, like, you've got to be flexible, you've got to be the process, right? But if you were part of an organization, what would be your guidance to say if you saw them moving towards this more ISO standard for user experience? How would you coach them to move away from that and to stay flexible?
Well, so I think there's 2 questions there. So going back to the situation where you have the person who's been beaten down and hand slapped and is getting super jaded, move on. This is not the organization for you.
It's time to get out.
It is doing bad things to you. If you're a UX designer, you have options all over the place. It's just way easier to work that way. But if you are looking at, you know, how do you essentially show the value of UX without or convey what UX does without intimidating people or making people think it's super expensive. I'm a huge fan of the word framework over the word process. Yeah. Because the way I define a process is these are a bunch of things that you have to do. And there's, you have to go from step 1 to step 83B/6 or, whatever it is.
You're right. Like putting together IKEA furniture.
Exactly. But with more frowny faces than smiley faces. A framework here is a series of characteristics that this approach needs to have, essentially, or a series of things that need to be in place. So when we worked together, my catchword was buckets.
Yes, buckets.
So I used to talk about the 5 buckets. So there's the B bucket, which stands for business, the user bucket, because we're user experience designers, content, which contains both what I would call content strategy and information architecture, as well as design. That's another bucket. So there's the interaction design layer, there's the UI design layer, and then finally evaluation. Now, technically, evaluation can fit in any of the other buckets very, very easily.
Or in all at the same time.
It's best for that to be the case.
Okay.
But what I found was that if you leave that one off, then it gets forgotten. Now, keep in mind, my context for developing this was putting together tons and tons and tons of proposals for agency work. And we wanted to make sure that our UX team was providing all of the value that they could provide. And the way that I helped them do that was through the bucket framework. Now, if you think of these 5 things as actual buckets, what do buckets do? They hold stuff.
They do.
So, and assuming, there's, the physical integrity of the bucket, et cetera, let's not overstretch this.
Yeah. No, we can. We got time. Let's do this. Let's do this. Double down.
No, the direction is make sure that your approach has something in every bucket. And you can do that for a $20,000 UX project. You can do that for a $2 million UX project. It just depends on how much you put in each bucket. For example, you might be working with a client who has been thinking about an app for 3 years, and they come to us, and what they don't want to hear is, no, we need to do a 3-month user research study before we can get started. That's not going to be helpful. But it's an app, so we know that there's going to be a lot of interactivity. They want to start with screens. We can do that. I know this is like heresy what I'm saying. But basically what we're doing is we're just getting their ideas out of their head. And then if we do the interaction design, we prototype that, and then we put it in front of people, we're actually doing some user research as we evaluate it at the same time. And then what we learn from that typically is going to inform the strategy. So the big Silicon Valley word pivot, this is something that can happen at that point. A person's idea is faithfully represented in front of the people he intends it for. Then what happens is like, oh, well, that idea isn't actually going to work out for this audience at all. But my brother, who is a pheasant hunter in South Dakota, would love this, things like that. So the idea begins to evolve. So this is a completely non-standard UX practice, but it has strategy, it has user research, it has design. I don't think I covered content in this, but we would assume that we would cover, we would get through that. And then it has some evaluation in it too. And so that process makes sure that we have conveyed all of the value that we can for, let's say that this is a relatively low budget client. But we could do something where there's a lot more unknowns, for example. So we will spend a lot of time in the strategy and user research side, and then the design component of it might be very, very light. There might be, a very high, low fidelity prototype that comes out of it as part of the recommendations, and that could be something that feeds into a phase 2. But we've done all of the things. Mm-hmm. Now, the caveat here is that this is a framework for when you're doing like a wreck and rebuild, or when you're doing something new from scratch, something like that. If there is, literally a feature to add, I think you could think in terms of the framework, but maybe not be quite so. I feel weird talking about being rigid with a framework, but maybe you don't have to be so super rigid about it because, for example, maybe this is a phase 2 of a thing. You've already done a lot of research, so you can just start with what you have.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that you still have the buckets. Maybe some of these buckets have already been filled in previous engagement. So I like that approach. Let's talk about a couple of ways people get kind of stuck, I see. One is in that prototyping phase where you need to get stuff done. So at my company, Foundry, we're a digital product development company. So we build products for people, and everything we do has a prototype. We don't do anything without it. There's just no way around it.
I think I've just fallen in love with you a little bit, Cori.
We don't do anything without prototypes, and we don't do anything without testing those prototypes because it's a waste of money, because the code costs so much more to move a button in than it does when it's in Envision. And so being able to teach clients, and education is a big part of what we do, but from your perspective, let's say I'm at a place where I'm the only UX designer and I've got a deadline, right? I love everything Fred has been saying on this podcast about covering my buckets and filling these things and doing all this stuff. But if I don't get this done by Friday, if I don't get these wireframes done, I'm going to be in trouble. How can I start to break that cycle when, this is what the expectation is that we're chopping it up, we're, shipping it out the door. We got to ship, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is why I like buckets, is because the minimum amount of stuff that you can put in a bucket is a drop. So what does a drop of strategy look like? What does a drop of user research look like? We have tons and tons of different methods to choose from as user experience designers. Now, if this person is more junior, that's a really challenging situation.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have a good advice for someone in that particular situation. But if you're a senior designer and you've done lots of different kinds of things, this is where you can rely on your skill mastery to figure out, okay, what crazy little thing that can we do to get some input? Like, for example, when we worked for a paint client at the Nerdery, many people at the Nerdery really liked to paint their houses. Lots of people do that. So the project team reached out to those people and did a little bit of work with those people. Super fast, just a few drops. They put together a paper prototype. It was actually designed together.
Yeah.
So this is, so it was actually kind of looked like a little bit high visual fidelity, but you could just do a quick sketch. Do you really need to have full-on annotated wireframes in order to ship? Or do you need a sketch, and a few sketches, and a seat next to a developer? It depends on what's really, really important for the particular kind of thing that you're doing. Maybe you need to put more drops into strategy and fewer drops into the wireframes.
Sure. So if I'm that designer and I'm working towards those goals, and I want to show this off internally to folks, how have you seen that successful? Is it do a lunch and learn? Is it do presentations? Is it just word of mouth? Like, what are some ways that you've seen successful in promoting these wins and these ways that you're trying to adapt and improve and grow as a user experience designer or team?
Yeah, I think that's really culturally dependent. So there are some organizations that really like big meetings, and those organizations, you have to go with what works there, and you have to get all the people in a room, set expectations, especially if you're showing something that's very low fidelity.
Sure.
And then go for it. Otherwise, other types of organizations, think one-on-one works really well. So you're sort